Right. So I think we'll start our session so that we do justice to all of us. A very warm welcome to all of you, my most respected speakers and friends in the audience. Refractive surgery is at its zenith today with very competitive surgeries sharing the same platform with a lot of success stories. Sometimes it actually makes sense for us to look at the ever evolving updates and the controversies that threaten it, and that would unravel more information and make it a smoother terrain for us and evolve a better understanding. There is a very small change in the sequence. Shreyash Ramamurthy alone would be going in first. Shreyash is a young, extremely dynamic surgeon, consultant cataract, refractive, and cornea from the Eye Foundation group of hospitals based at Coimbatore. And he's going to be talking on iatrogenic ectasia, how best to restore. Of course, it's the least of the problems. The percent incidence is so low, but then we need to know it because it's something very dreaded. On to you, Shreyas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And at the outset, apologies for having going ahead in the queue. So I'll quickly take you all through the various management aspects of iatrogenic ectasia. Before we go into the management itself, one thing we must know in iatrogenic ectasia is that early detection is extremely important. But what's even more important is to differentiate from regression or decentered ablation. So this was a patient who had a regression, mild early IS asymmetry. But here, if you can see, the anterior posterior floats are absolutely normal. And this is a very important point for us to detect, a very subtle superior decentration, which can make the inferior as a part of the cornea look steeper. And this IS asymmetry makes it look as if this is an early onset ectasia. So it's important for us to analyze it as a whole, look at the kind of...
Recording in progress. So how it has helped? It improves clarity by forming a uniform layer over the eyepiece. We have not seen it.
Could you mute it so that we can hear our sessions talk? Yes.
So the other aspect is that even in certain devices like OrbScan, this is a very old scan of a patient where you can see a fairly high ablation has been done. We were actually believing that there is an increase in the posterior shift of the corneal curvature after any laser ablative procedures. But then we learned that this is an artifact. So these are certain things that we need to watch out for before we diagnose a patient with iatrogenic ectasia. Early onset ectasia we can just observe with spectacles, contact lenses, but possibly cross-linking comes much earlier in the algorithm for management of iatrogenic ectasia than it would even in a patient with keratoconus. The reason possibly is that post-LASIK ectasia, unlike in keratoconus, is possibly done at diagnosis because the chances that a patient with iatrogenic ectasia would progress at a much later age is much higher. There is also a question of possibly slightly decreased efficacy of the cross-linking procedure in iatrogenic ectasia. As we all know, cross-linking tends to cross-link at the anterior 250 microns of the cornea, where the first 120, 130 microns goes away in the flap itself. Localized treatments for normalization is now becoming a key thing. And customized cross-linking would be exceedingly useful in a patient with an iatrogenic ectasia, as they are more likely to have a greater degree of IS asymmetry, a localized elevation, and a localized flattening and strengthening is something which would be a great idea in these patients. We have customized patterns which can also address astigmatism, and also with pupillary tracking ensure that they get adequate cross-linking, but at the same time, adequate flattening as well. After, apart from cross-linking, we have to see whether it's a central or eccentric cone. The chances of having a slightly more eccentric cone is more likely in iatrogenic ectasia. But having said that, if you do have a patient with central cone and patient has sufficient thickness, mind you, post-LASIK ectasia may not have good thickness and are more likely to have reduced thickness. But then comes the question, is an ablating an already a cornea which has undergone ectasia after ablation a good idea? But we must remember that here, since we are ablating only 50 microns, the high likelihood that we are only ablating the flap. And it's unlikely we are disturbing the stroma in any way. This was just one such patient with a post-LASIK ectasia, but with good thickness in this patient, and subsequent to topographic guided treatment, the patient had good improvement in both uncorrected and best corrected visual acuity, as well as stabilization of the ectasia. Again, as discussed earlier, the epithelium itself can be a great masking agent in any form of ectasia, especially post-LASIK treatments where epithelial hyperplasia is very, very common. This is just one such patient where the epithelium has gone on evolving during the first 9 months after the procedure. So it's extremely important that we map the epithelium, get a true idea of how the stromal curvature is and how the stroma is, and then go ahead and perform the treatment. The next viable option, especially if it's an eccentric cone, is intracorneal ring segments. Intacs works extremely well in post-LASIK ectasia, possibly even better than in keratoconus. And it's reserved for patients who have a visual acuity of maybe less than 612, where you can't do a topography guided treatment. These are the factors which play an important role as far as planning is concerned. If you have a centered cone, you can use symmetric rings, or if you have a decentered cone where 50% of the cone is outside the central 3 millimeter zone, you can use asymmetric rings. You also have a single ring segments, which are, especially if there is a high ISA symmetry, giving a single inferior ring is very, very useful. We also have the smaller arc ring segments, where especially in the early forms of ectasia, you have more astigmatism than the amount of myopia. So you don't want global flattening, but you want a flattening along the region where there is increase in the curvature along that particular meridian. And these 90-degree arc segments work extremely well. This was just an example of a patient with iatrogenic ectasia. As you can see here, fairly significant power, and post Intacs, there is a marked improvement in symmetry and reduction in the power and improvement in the UCVA and BCVA. Visual improvement after Intacs, if there is a significant residual error and a significant irregularity, contact lenses may be necessary. However, we may have to go in for mini-scleral lenses, as fitting the standard lenses can be more challenging. Post intracorneal ring segments for low residual error, we could, if there is sufficient thickness, consider a PRK or a topo-guided PRK also. However, they do have an increased propensity for haze, and we need to watch out for that. You could, if there is a significant residual error or a high degree of anisometropia, toric phakic intraocular lenses are also an excellent option. And 6 to 12 months after documenting stability from the primary cross-linking procedure, we could go ahead with a phakic intraocular lens, either if it's well-centered, good best spectacle corrected visual acuity, or post-intracorneal ring segments after a minimum 6-month interval, 2 consequent revisits where topography and refraction is stable. You can go ahead with the toric phakic lens, and these patients tend to do very, very well. Finally, DALK, of course, if the visual axis is not clear or very advanced, you could go ahead and do a DALK procedure. I'll not go into the details. Truth be told, fortunately, we haven't had a situation where we had to do a DALK for a patient with an iatrogenic ectasia. This is a patient with keratoconus. But having said that, if a need arises, we can do DALK even in these procedures and give excellent results. So we have a wide arrangement of treatment options, and with judicious decision-making and combination therapy, we can give rise to optimal outcomes. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Yes, I have a question for you, Shreyas. There are these symptoms of regression and iatrogenic ectasia. Sometimes they tend to mimic each other. How best?
So that was my first slide. I mean, when a patient comes back with an error, sometimes it might be an isolated cylindrical power, and we are worried whether this is an early onset ectasia or whether this is regression. So we have to take into account what was the preoperative pachymetry. Has there been the reduction in pachymetry? Is it corresponding to the amount of ablation which should have taken place? The flattening in the curvature, is it corresponding to what ablation we were expecting in the preoperative period? If this is not the case, there is a sudden increase in the curvature, or there is a disproportionate decrease in pachymetry, or if there is an elevation on the posterior float. Regression should not be accompanied with elevation in posterior float. And it's a good idea for all your laser vision correction patients, at least in the early follow-up, within the first 2 to 4 months or 2 to 6 months, we get a baseline topography done. So whenever they come back for a follow-up visit, we know what the change has been from the baseline topography, and this will help us to further easily differentiate between regression and early ectasia.
Dr. Praveen or Gaurav, any one question before we go on to our next speaker? To Shreyas, because he won't be staying on with us.
No, that was a great presentation, Shreyas. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Very welcome.
Thank you, Shreyas.
Thank you.
See if you could join us back. We shall now go on to our first speaker who needs no introduction, who's the chairman and medical director of Drishti Eye Center in Dehradun and is also a leading cataract and refractive surgeon of our country, Chairman IRSI2, and let us hear his pulse on updates on epithelial mapping and relevance to refractive surgery selection standpoint.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chitra ma'am, for inviting me to your course. And, it's a great feeling to be amongst the stalwarts of refractive surgery here. And I have been quite passionate about epithelial thickness mapping, and it's really helped us improve the way we manage our cases and the way we look at our cases. So ever since we started doing this, it's been a learning experience, and it continues to be one. And I have no financial interest. So epithelial thickness mapping has been around for a few years now. Maybe, we've been talking about it for 5-6 years, but it caught on more in the last 3-4 years. And that's because, more and more devices are now able to do a good job at mapping. I got the Avanti RTView about 3-4 years back. Around that time, Optoview already had a model which was doing it, and Zeiss had a model which was doing it, but not that well. Today, we have devices like the MS39, which takes it to another level and does even better thickness mapping than most of these other devices. Our Avanti RTView gives excellent predictability of epithelium maps as well. And we've tested it not only on virgin corneas, but post CXL and post so many other treatments, post PRK and trans PRK. We've been doing studies with those, and it's been really, really good for us. So it's quite repeatable, as was demonstrated in the study by Dan Reinstein, where they compared automated measurements with the manual measurements done by 2 observers. And they found that in spite of manual measurements being done, the automated system kind of beat the computer algorithm, beat the manual measurements, which is supposed to be the gold standard. And also the another study done by David Huang, where they compared against the normal, central, superior, and inferior, and if they found these differences with the keratoconus maps as well. So the repeatability was good. So this is how a normal cornea would look, and typically the epithelium thickness is about 10% of the corneal thickness, but that's not always the case, and that's what we've learned over the years. I do have patients who are coming for refractive surgery and have corneas of say 480, and they'll have epithelium of 51 or 52 microns, and there will be others who will be 600 corneas, and they will have a pachymetry epithelium of just about 50-51. And if you are planning to do a surface ablation procedure, especially a trans epithelial procedure, you have to be very, very careful, because you can make a mistake there. And similarly, in post-refractive surgery eyes, you will sometimes miss the game if you are not doing epithelium mapping, because there will be patients, in fact, where the epithelium will surprise you. So this is a patient on the left, which is a LASIK, post-LASIK, -2 diopters, where the epithelium is about 60. On the right is another one with a post-PRK, where the epithelium is as much as 70 right in the center. Now, this is because of the compensatory epithelial hyperplasia following flattening of the cornea, and it is only to be expected, but sometimes it can be different. It can be different, and each person, in fact, behaves so differently that it's always great to watch how these patients respond post-surgery. So in our clinic, post-refractive surgery patients and pre-refractive surgery are always screened for epithelium maps, and so are the keratoconus patients. Now, this is a typical map of a patient with a keratoconus, where you will see this is the pachymetry map of the cornea, where you will have the area of the cone where there is a thinning, and this is the area, because of the projection of the cone, the epithelium also becomes much thinner, and you'll have compensatory hypertrophy superiorly at the opposite side. So these are very typical, and when you have subtle maps like these, even when you may not see anything on the pentacam maps or other maps, you should start looking at these very suspiciously. And on the other hand, when a cornea looks suspect on the other devices, but the epithelium maps don't show you any of these features, it can be reassuring that it may be just an artifact, and you should look back and repeat your scans as well. So it works both ways. And this is again a typical keratoconus map, where it's more advanced, and you can see that because of the apical thinning, the epithelium seems to get very thin. And of course, again, there will be a compensatory hypertrophy over here on top and below there. So epithelium maps have a totally different story to tell. Now, this is an ortho K cornea, where you can see that what it tries to achieve is to have central, using the tight fit of the ortho K lenses. It tends to produce temporary, overnight wear, corrects the myopia, and so it brings about these epithelium changes. In India, since it's not popular, so it probably doesn't have so much role. And post-refractive surgery in hyperopic LASIK is very interesting to see these maps where the mid-peripheral cornea is showing because of the guttering effect of the hyperopic ablations, there's compensatory epithelium thickening in the peripheral areas, not in the center. So the central epithelium actually becomes thinner, whereas there is a compensatory epithelial hypertrophy there. And this is why regressions may happen in hyperopic surgeries as well. Sometimes you have surprises where it's much more than what you would expect. This is, of course, a post-PRK central steepening, and you can see the compensatory thinning at the edge of the optical zone. But this is only because the central area is, having an epithelial hypertrophy. Now, the stroma maps are also very useful. So if you're watching these patients post laser vision correction, you can see that the stroma maps are also going to give you a different story, and then the compensatory epithelial hypertrophy here. So this can help you study your post-refractive surgery patients well. Now, this is a patient where you might want to differentiate a contact lens warpage from a keratoconus, and typically a warpage would look somewhat like this, where there will be, because of the tight fit of the contact lenses, you may have epithelial hypertrophies. It can present in many different funny ways, but this is one of the situations where it might happen. But you can differentiate it from keratoconus, where there is thinning of the epithelium as well as the cone. The pachymetry maps are also thinner over there, and this is how they will stand out differently. Dry eye is a totally different game, and maybe Rohit will later on tell us a little bit, because whatever I have read in literature is that in dry eye you cannot predict how the epithelium is going to behave. It behaves in so many different ways, and there is no consensus. So I will not waste my time on that. I'll quickly come to suspect corneas, and where you have these patients where obviously the left eye has this skew in the axis, but the right eye looks so pretty good, except that the epithelium, the corneal thickness maps are the pachymetry is a little bit suspect here, but the left one is obviously a abnormal cornea. And if you look at the bad displays, the right eye shows a suspicious bump over there. Left one shows a frank keratoconus, but look at the epithelium maps. The left, of course, is showing frank keratoconus, but the right one is showing again compensatory hypertrophy, and it so stands out over here that this is typically the right eye also would be a highly suspicious eye to do any kind of laser procedure over there. So you could also monitor refractive surprises and surface ablations. You can use the epithelium mapping for your trans-PTK planning, trans-epithelial PRK plannings, because you can have customized epithelium removal in some of the machines. Enhancement planning, again, this lady who presented to us for an enhancement post LASIK almost 10 years after surgery wanted to get a surface ablation done. When we did, and she had come to us for trans-PRK. When we did the epithelium mapping, we had significant epithelial hyperplasia as expected. And now, obviously, this cannot be treated, or at least on my laser, the wavelight laser, because it does not customize epithelium removal. So you do not want to do trans PRKs on post LASIK enhancements because of the epithelium being thicker in the center if you're doing a myopic or the other way around. And her mother had an epithelial ingrowth following a flap lift, because of which she did not want a flap lift at all. So we had to do an alcohol assisted one. Coming to the last, I'll just come to one last case here, because I think we're going to run out of time. This is a refractive surgery dilemma where we took Rohit's help actually for this patient, because we were in a situation where the pentacam maps looked fairly good, except some steep areas in the left eye. The bad maps looked really good. We did an epithelium mapping. The right eye was pristine. The left eye showed this funny epithelial hyperplasia, which we could not understand. We sent the patient back and called back after a week or two of using lubricants. And when we repeated, it still showed up exactly the same. The lady had been off contact lenses for almost a month. The right eye continued to look well. The left eye continued to look bad. We sent all this data to Rohit's team, and they did the epithelium Bowman's interface studies and sent us back these maps where they did the Bowman's layer mapping, and it showed up as being absolutely healthy. And then we obviously had postponed this patient for surgery. She came back later, and about a few months later, when we did the pentacams and everything had become absolutely fine. So it was basically a contact lens warpage. So to summarize, I think epithelium thickness mapping has become a really useful and reliable, predictable tool for the cornea and refractive surgeon, especially for refractive surgery planning, and where you would want to rule out suspect corneas, and for keratoconus evaluations and post-CXL patients for follow-ups, and can often find the missing link in dilemma situations. And when combined with biomechanical studies and surface mapping, it can really give us better understanding. And with that, I think I'll stop here.
It was a wonderful talk, Gaurav. Had us hearing all of it. You nearly answered me in the last few slides, but anyway, for the general audience, like epithelial mapping may not be done as frequently. So what it would be inadequate if you are going to do an enhancement on the PRK mode without an epithelial mapping? What is it we may lose?
So, if we are, first of all, we would want to see whether the epithelium, whether it has behaved naturally as it should following a post-refractive surgery. For example, if you've done a big myopic ablation, does it show consistent epithelial thickening in the center as well? And if you're going to do the enhancement, you might want to see, because you don't know how the epithelium is going to react in future as well. Suppose you go and do the surface ablation and you do an enhancement, and the next time that the epithelium heals is not going to be as consistent as, coming back to what it was. It would be very different healing than from what was in the virgin eye. So that way you may end up having a surprise which you may not be prepared for. So I think having a knowledge of the epithelium thicknesses pre-op in every refractive surgery patient, be it enhancement or even otherwise, is very, very valuable. And then of course also for the PRK planning, if you're doing a transepithelial and you have central much thicker epithelium and peripheral much thinner, your whole thing will go wrong and you'll end up creating a mess for the patient. So I think in both ways it's important.
Okay. So supposing your epithelium is actually quite thick, then what would you do? You have to treat them for the regression. It shows epithelial hyperplasia. How would you treat them?
So if it is an early post-op period, I would wait and watch, let it stabilize, watch it for a couple of months and let it stabilize. And then, but if a patient has come after a few years for an enhancement and it's not directly because of epithelial hypertrophy, then I would just go ahead and treat it on the surface, even though, because that would be something which has been stable over the years. And I would still, go ahead and treat it as I would, any other patient
No,
with,
what
it's
I
not
wanted to ask what I wanted to ask was, the patient has epithelial hyperplasia, and that has been the cause for the regression, the increased epithelial. Would you wonder whether, if it is within the 3-year period, golden period, which we seem to call, would you wonder whether you would lift a flap for these eyes instead of treating on the surface?
Absolutely. So in the early, if I had a LASIK patient, I would lift the flap in the first year or two, because that would be, much more predictable. And frankly, I would like to differentiate between regression and progression, because, there are times when, patient has been stable for a long time and then goes on to develop a progression. There, I would, in the longer period, I would not hesitate to do a surface enhancement. But if it's a regression and it's documented that it's a regression, I would then have to think and make a plan based on the epithelium mapping.
I'm sure Kumar is going to tell us a lot more details on that very interesting topic. Our next speaker, thanks a lot, Gaurav. Our next speaker is Dr. Praveen Krishna, heading the Cornea and Refractive Department of LVPI, a very versatile, dynamic surgeon with a huge experience in cataract, cornea, and refractive challenges, and in particular on PRK. And he's going to tell us a lot of top pearls as to how to address PRK haze. We look forward to hear from you. Dr. Praveen, you could share your slides.
Yeah, I hope you can see my slides right now. So thanks again, Chitra. I think really grateful for including me in this session. So I'm going to be speaking about a topic that is really close to my heart, which is about PRK and haze for a number of reasons. So what is important to remember when you're talking about post-PRK and haze is there are several different kinds of haze that you need to remember, and how do you identify them? There is early onset haze that tends to occur in the first few months after PRK. And then there is late onset haze, also called breakthrough corneal haze, which tends to occur later on after the first 3 months after PRK. Typically, it is limited to the optic zone where you ablate. And the typical appearance is it is granular or stippled. So early or transient haze tends to be more diffuse, tends to be in a wider area, and tends to be more uniform. Whereas late or persistent haze tends to have the kind of appearance which almost appears as if it is elevated above the surface. So it's also important to differentiate this kind of haze from a scar that occurs inside the cornea. The configuration and the appearance are different. And one of the best methods to differentiate these two is to look at the OCT. Post-PRK haze is always subepithelial or at the level of the previous Bowman's layer, whereas scarring can occur at whatever level the stroma has been affected by any intervention that you might have performed. So that's the difference between scar and haze. So why does haze occur? Again, I'm not going to bore you with some basic science slides, but again, it's very important to understand wound healing after PRK to understand why haze occurs. For the cornea, it does not know the difference between an injury and a surgery, and it reacts the same way to surgery as it does to an injury. So in the first 4 hours after a PRK surgery is done, there is apoptosis or loss of keratocytes in the zone immediately below the ocular surface, and sometimes extending up to 250 to 300 microns from the surface. which is what you'll see with the tunnel reddish stain here with the keratocytes. In some time, about 72 hours or later, these keratocytes that actually are left behind the zone of apoptosis start to become transformed into fibroblasts. And these move anteriorly, and these actually initiate the sequence of haze. So haze actually occurs because of the synthesis of new extracellular matrix in the subepithelial area. And that's why you need to prevent it or control this mechanism. And early on, this control is achieved by either using mitomycin C to prevent the conversion of these keratocytes into activated fibroblasts, and also the use of steroids to reduce the synthesis of new extracellular matrix. So how common is haze? Haze actually is not very common. The time to diagnosis for early haze is about 2 months after surgery. For severe or late haze is about 4 to 6 months after surgery. Also, it's important to know that higher myopia who undergo PRK tend to have a slightly higher incidence of haze as compared to those who are lower myopes. Interestingly, astigmatism is an independent risk factor for development of haze, and high astigmatism also means there is a higher chance of developing haze after surgery. What about age? There doesn't seem to be any correlation between age and haze, can occur in any age, but one of the most important characteristics of haze is it tends to develop in patients who we do not use mitomycin C, and it tends to occur less in patients where mitomycin C is used for a longer duration. In fact, mitomycin C seems to be the biggest factor in reducing the relative risk of haze after PRK surgery. So is the concentration of mitomycin C important? Again, there's very little data here, but it seems that whether you use 0.02% or 0.002%, apparently it seems to have the same effect. And there are similar studies with 0.01% as well. So are there alternatives to mitomycin? There have been several alternatives that have been studied, but it seems that mitomycin C probably has the greatest efficacy in reducing the amount of haze after PRK at this point of time. What about steroids? Using steroids again is fundamental to preventing haze, and it seems as if the first 6 months of using steroids after PRK is very important. For mild to moderate myopia, essential to use steroids for about 3 months. For higher myopia, for about 6 months. There also are individual publications about the kind of steroids. It doesn't seem to matter whether you use very strong steroids or very weak steroids. The duration is more important than steroids, and steroids are also found to be more effective as compared to topical agents such as cyclosporin in reducing haze. So how much does haze affect vision? Interestingly, haze does affect vision to a certain extent, but only if it is severe. And in fact, if you look at controls versus those who had haze, if you look at the higher order aberrations, they don't seem to be very much higher in those patients with haze. And in fact, if you look at the graph on the right side, where the blue bars are those are the controls, the red are those of the haze, the controls actually seem to have higher order aberrations as compared to those with haze, except coma. Coma seems to be higher in those patients who have haze. So when we looked at our data at LVP, where we do about 60% of PRK surgery at this point of time, compared to only about 30% of LASIK, we found that we have an even distribution of where we do our PRKs, but the largest number of PRK patients were between 3 and 6 diopters of myopia. Mean spherical equivalent in the 4 groups was as shown, and we tried to compare the outcomes of PRK in 4 different groups of patients. We found that the uncorrected visual acuity was similar, whether the myopia was 0 to 3, 3 to 6, or 6 to 9 diopters. Similarly, accuracy was very similar between these groups as well, and stability was very similar in these groups as well. What was interesting is in the high myopes, where we had PRK for more than 9 diopters, the stability was a little lower as the accuracy was a little lower as compared to those who had very low myopia, which is expected just because of the amount of myopia. But when it came to haze, we found that those patients who had moderate to severe haze did not seem to be correlated with very high or low myopia. Moderate haze was equally present in all groups 0 to 3 as well as more than 9. Severe haze was more frequent in those patients who had high myopia as compared to those who had low myopia. And in fact, the numbers were very low, and over time, the haze tend to resolve by itself even without intervention. And when we looked at the number of patients that we had to intervene in, of close to 14,000 eyes that underwent PRK in the last 5 years, we found that only about 0.15% of post-PRK patients required an intervention. And of this group of patients, about 3/4 required intervention because of residual or because of refractive error issues, and only about 30% required repeat PRK or repeat PTK because of haze. So only 6 out of close to 14,000 eyes needed surgery for post-PRK haze, and this was an incidence of only 0.04%, which is extremely low. We also found that time to recovery because of early onset haze was slightly more delayed in higher myopes as compared to lower myopes. So the higher the myopia, the longer the wait for resolution of haze. How do you treat haze? Well, it seems as if the best method to treat haze that is visually significant is to do a PTK in these corneas. And you can do this by using OCT to help you decide depth of the ablation. And usually the outcomes are extremely good visually. The refractive corrections may not be as predictable after PRK. So this is the same patient immediately after the PTK was done. And this patient, you see, has complete removal of the haze that occurred post-PRK surgery. So to summarize about post-PRK haze, it seems that early onset haze is usually transient and does not require any intervention. Late onset haze is actually quite rare, and I don't think we need to worry about it if you're doing PRK in the mid-range or lower range of patients who have myopia. But it is important to remember that it is easier to prevent haze than to treat haze. And that's the reason why it's important to focus on using mitomycin C during surgery and also steroids for a significant duration of time after surgery. And to end, PTK is a good option in case you have post-PRK haze and usually results in very good outcomes, though the patient might have some amount of refractive error. Thank you very much.
Excellent talk, Dr. Praveen. I mean, though I was so tired, I heard every word of it. Repeat it, actually. It was so good. So I just want your thoughts on this. What do you think about CXL with PRK, especially when you're treating high refractive errors?
We've been using CXL with PRK mainly in the subgroup of patients with keratoconus. And it seems as if there also initially we did not use mitomycin C because we thought that some amount of haze and scarring is beneficial. But then we found that the haze in this group was much higher than if you don't use mitomycin C. So we started using mitomycin C as well. But typically for high myopia, we don't add on CXL along with PRK. It seems that biomechanically, that they don't require collagen cross-linking.
So you don't believe in cross-linking per se with laser vision correction as of now?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other question, or shall we go on to the next speaker? Okay. Our next speaker, you stay with us, Dr. Praveen. Our next speaker is Dr. Rohit Shetty, who needs no introduction, who's the Vice Chairman of the Narayan Netralaya Group, an innovator, a scientist with a very questioning mind, who makes you perceive and see things differently. And a good friend, very good friend of mine. On to you, Dr. Rohit Shetty.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. And thanks for this opportunity. My talk is biomechanics. Has it failed us or do we know it better? These are my financial interests. In the interest of time, because I know we have only 5 minutes, I'm not going to go into depth of all.
7 minutes.
7 minutes. So let's not going to go too much into all this, but people who use Pentacam and Corvus would probably understand these indices. The indices of BAD-D, which is there from your Pentacam, the CBI, your Corvus biomechanical index, and the topography based biomechanical index. And cutoff for this has been quite good, depends on who is publishing. Renato Groups publishes this, Vinsugura's group publishes this. So it always depends on who's publishing this, always this differs. Reasons why biomechanics is confusing and makes us feel we have failed. This is very important part of today's discussion. One is we are looking at the viscoelastic properties of the cornea, which depends a lot on hydration. It depends a lot on intraocular pressure, depends a lot on repeatability of the scan, the quality of scan, the strength of scans. All this somehow we miss when we do a biomechanical assessment, because it doesn't give you like a Pentacam or a Topalizer or a Placido. It doesn't just show up that your scans are bad. For example, we all know about this concept of what elastic, the viscoelastic nature, the hysteresis was what was coined with the ORA. Now, they spoke about two components, deformation amplitude was an important thing when we started with Corvus in the late 2010 onwards. But now the concepts have changed. We really moved on. It depends a lot on the hydration state. And that's why, sometimes we make real mess of how we understand the biomechanics. Intraocular pressure plays an important role. This is the right and the left eye. The intraocular pressure in the right eye is 7 millimeters of mercury. And the CBI, look at the CBI, the intraocular pressure in the left eye is 18 millimeters of mercury. The stronger your intraocular pressure, the difficult it is to deform. So one of the reasons we don't understand is we have somehow missed putting all this together and looking at the biomechanic tools. I don't know why the glaucoma people are evaluating. There's only a small difference in the PACI, but the intraocular pressure is different by 10. And look at the indices. So never look at the biomechanical indices without understanding the intraocular pressure. So this is the first thing why we make mess out of this. Repeatability of scan is very important. Any of these things means that your scans are poor. You look at the maps. This is noise. When you have noise, you will always get a different biomechanical measurements. Never look at the scans, repeat it again. This is the confusion why makes a lot of people feel it's useless. Your bad D is abnormal. These two are normal. Or your CBI is normal, TBI is normal, and bad D may be normal. Now, what do we do with this? This is a confusion which we have. We are having this confusion because we are all blind men looking at one aspect of it and trying to make an assessment of a particular disease, of a particular type of corneal viscoelasticity. So what do we do with this? What's the true picture? Let's discuss one case for interest of time. This is a patient who has a bad D being normal. It's on a suspicious side. This is normal, and this is on the borderline. And you can see all of them are speaking differently. And you have a huge bump here. Now, epithelium is normal. You don't have to worry about it. This is where I call about the elephant. If you are looking at one aspect of it, you call it normal. If you're looking at a biomechanical aspect, you will call it normal. So there is this confusion which keeps happening. The last 2 years has been extensive work with collagen imaging. And this is a different topic by itself. It looks at like how you had the GDX, looks at the collagen polarization. What you see in darker shades of blue is normal. And what you see is the peripheral fibers like you see here. So we started looking at all these images and trying to see, does it match with your corneal biomechanics? That's when you start feeling that you understand the biomechanics very well. For example, the bad D is abnormal here. The CBI and the TBI are more or less normal. So now the question is, what do you expect of the collagen? If you go by the biomechanics, your collagen should be normal. If you go by the topography, it should be abnormal. Now, let's go out and look at the elephant as a whole. Then you see the collagen here matches very well with what is normal. So this collagen is actually normal. Maybe this small changes, and this patient also had a small posterior elevation, was probably because of epithelial thickness or changes. But this is one of the reasons why you have it. Now look at the second case. It's a very interesting case, and this is where the biomechanics plays a role. The bad D is normal because you have a perfectly normal cornea. Suddenly you see the CBI and TBI, both CBI is actually on the red. This is on little bit bordering. You can call it normal plus or minus abnormal. Now, what is happening here? Why is this a change? Now let's look at the collagen. The whole central collagen, the polarization is poor. I don't call it loss, it's poor polarization. And just look at the comparison here. Now, after this, we can discuss this particular case. Now you tell me, is it our understanding which was poor or the machine was poor? I personally feel it was understanding because we needed technologies to actually prove. And as we move on, give me 4 or 5 years, then we'll have more data. Then we'll probably have an algorithm for this. But at this point of time, I personally feel there is a good amount of data to support that, at least in 80%, 85% of the time, the biomechanics is telling the truth, especially in these cases, because you know that this is a normal looking eye, but a weak cornea. So just don't ignore it. So how do we prove that this is whatever I'm saying is still the truth? Same patient underwent the PRK and we did the molecular assessment. When you did the molecular assessment of this, what we were saying was true. When we did the molecular assessment of the same cornea with a good collagen, the collagen and the lysyl oxidant, all the markers I've been talking about for many, many years were all normal. But look at the collagen of the same patients who had a poorer collagen. I did the PRK. I know that this is going to be stable, and these were all completely abnormal, which says that the biomechanics was actually telling the truth. You can see the biomechanics here was very poor. I can see those changes out here. The future is all about prediction. I don't want to go into this. We build the software. This is probably going to be part of the Oculus Pentacam, where you look at the different level of stiffening of the cornea. We are not looking at one parameter. This is a mathematical model driven. It comes in newtons per meter. That means your spring model is used, not just deformation. It looks at multiple parameters and has its own assessment. It tells you if you do a PRK on a particular patient, does it fall into an ectasia zone of weakness or in the normal zone? And you can put different things. You can write PRK, LASIK, SMILE, extra, whatever you want to do. And this is how the biomechanics is going to go in the future. A small algorithm about how we plan to do it. When you have biomechanics normal and structurally abnormal, consider PRK. When biomechanics and structurally both are abnormal, then you can look at an ICL as the procedure. These are the team with whom I work, and they helped me to make this presentation. Thank you. I will close my presentation now.
Thank you very much, Rohit. That was a wonderful insight. So we heard what Dr. Praveen had to say. So how do you perceive the role of cross-linking in laser vision correction? Would it continue to remain an entrant today as it is now? Or do you think it'll never come into the scene, or it will come into the scene totally?
I would not answer yes or no at this point of time, because I'm trying to study this. It will take at least a year or two, at least a year to see how the collagen changes. Because now when you are really looking at the collagen properties, we get a completely new insight. So I can't be very sure, but I know of data from Sheetal Brat's group, which says that if they've done a long, lot of SMILE extra cases, they said that they didn't develop ectasia. At this point of time, I'd go with what they say. Extra might help, but I don't know. I don't know what happens to the collagen.
You had said that the case number 1 had normal epithelium or abnormal epithelium? Case number 1 which you presented.
It had a mild inferior stapling of the epithelium in one of the eyes. And maybe that is because that's why the biomechanics was normal and the topography was abnormal. But interestingly, sir, there are cases where a completely normal eye has a googly in having a completely abnormal biomechanics. The case which I showed clearly shows that the biomechanics, especially CBI, I feel is very, very strong. If I had to pick up between two indices, I'd pick up CBI because it is not influenced by too much of topography and epithelium.
Then the thought process here, Rohit, would be that all patients who have to undergo surface, you have to remove a little epithelium, do a analysis.
No, sir.
No,
this was done. This was done just to prove what I was saying, and this was nothing to do with the clinical care. I mean, this is not practical at all. I just wanted to prove that what we were seeing was actually what is actually there in the eye. I'm sure this kind of thing would never work.
Our next speaker is Dr. Kumar Doctor, who's the chairman and MD of the Dr. Kumar Eye Hospital, another amazing surgeon with excellent skill sets. And he's going to tell us something interesting. Understanding regression and ectasia, the differentiators.
Thank you, Dr. Chitra Ramamurthy, to have asked me to participate in this course. I would like to thank Dr. Nivedita, who's a cornea person with me, who's helped me to create this. Now, the question is about regression and ectasia, because this danger sign in between is quite obvious, because the whole management and the treatment is going to change. So what happens really in regression is a tendency for an eye to return some part of the original refraction. So if you have treated -5, of course, it's not going to become -5 again, but the patient may get a -1, 1.5 again. So despite of advances in laser applications and the precision and the mode of corneal flap removal, regression in refractive error is still a known possibility, and we have to tell our patients about it. But over the number of years, recently, the regression amount has really dropped. So how much is our retreatment rate for regression is hardly less than 0.66%. Some documentation has done this. So modern lasers, newer updates of software, and data of so many years of LASIK, regression really is not a fear that we should have today. But how will we differentiate the two? So now the pathophysiology, a lot of discussion on epithelial thickness was documented. Sir, Dr. Praveen Krishnan and Dr. Gaurav both said something, and which is also going to be concluded in my talk, that yes, this is how we are looking at it. It has been noted that epithelial compensation is a major cause of optical regression after refractive surgery. So these patients will have an epithelial thickening. Corneal stroma can also undergo morphological changes. We know that they do undergo changes over the number of years, and in response to excimer laser, which can lead to refractive regression. So the basic pathophysiology is, of course, the regulation of the limbal stem cells, proliferation, increase in cyclosidine, and a concentration necessary precursor for refractive regression. Now, this chart is very, very commonly shown in most of the presentations, but if there is an epithelial debridement, either we do a surface treatment or we do a LASIK where there is a whole rim where the amount of epithelial cells are affected, then there is keratocytes proliferation, different factors come into play, haze-producing ECMs come into secretion. This leads to further epithelial hyperplasia, and this leads to regression. So this is a whole cycle that happens throughout the regression. I feel whenever we conclude whether it's regression or not, mapping the epithelium is very, very crucial. So now, in fact, some time back, we have started, whether we do LASIK or surface or whatever procedure, SMILE, we do epithelial thickness mapping for every patient as a protocol. And if you feel, then we are also trying to make a difference whether over 1 month and over 3 months, is there any change happening in normal LASIK patients or not? And that's the reason why you can see that there's a thickness that is there in the epithelium, which is in the center, is known that this will go into regression. As rightly pointed out by Dr. Gaurav, if the patient has got hyperopic LASIK, you may see thickening on the periphery, and this is where exactly the treatment had happened. Optical zone, if a small optical zone is there, it has known that it will cause higher chances of regression. Flap thickness, so if you have thick flap, like olden times we used to have 130 and 160, also leads to higher chances of regression. Older age group is associated with regression. And of course, pregnancy and lactation in women is known to have a factor that affects regression. As rightly pointed out by Dr. Praveen Krishnan, that if we do not use mitomycin, it will cause epithelial thickness and will cause some amount of regression. So now we all use mitomycin and a refractive correction about more than -5. But this is not seen in the new lasers and the new softwares which is there. And all of us don't decide to have a small optical zone. All of us have large optical zones depending on the size of the pupil. So management of regression, yes, it's very clear that if it's a good healthy flap, adequate residual thickness, and OCT-based assessment on the whole flap that was made. If you have an online pachy, we can know the thickness of the flap during the procedure. We have an online pachymeter, so we make a note of the thickness of the flap every time every surgery is done. And if all these parameters are good, the patient can go into a relift. But if it is a decentered flap, an irregular flap, a surface ablation, or a wavefront guided or a topo guided LASIK can be done. Coming to ectasia, corneal ectasia was first documented in 1998 by Professor Theo Seiler, and it's characterized by progression, steepening, and thinning of the cornea accompanied by topographic and tomographic changes. There is increase in myopia, astigmatism can be regular, irregular, decrease, and in uncorrected, best corrected visual acuity may also happen. And patient often complains of glare and halo. So despite we have done all the risk factors, development of ectasia, we have done all the care, patient can still develop ectasia and the picture may look like this. So a thorough pre-op examination is of course necessary. We know that a stable refraction, corneal topography, family history of keratoconus, many times we don't look at that, and ocular hysteresis has to be looked at. Now this patient operated many, many years back, presented to us with diminished vision in the right eye and the left eye, 660 and 612. And you can see that there is a thinning right in the center, which presented with ectasia. The patient was then underwent cross-linking with Intacs, and the patient's vision improved to 6/12 in that eye. So the left eye, you can see a posterior float, which went ahead quite a bit. So there in ectasia, then we have ectasia risk score system. And this was by Randleman and his group. There are different ways of looking at it. So you have to look at the residual stromal bed. We look at the age, the central corneal thickness, and there are points at 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So if all the topography and everything is normal with the residual bed, nowadays we all have the RST more than 300. I think this is a normal protocol followed by all of us. And if we do overlook any of these risk factors, then there is a chance that patients will develop haze. So if you are in a score between 0 and 2, there's a low risk. But if the score is 4, then there's a high risk that the patient will develop ectasia. So the new tool, of course, is the PTA. All of us also follow this, the flap thickness plus ablation depth divided by central corneal thickness. But I believe there was a huge study in Korea, some of you might know about this, where in one eye they followed the PTA, in the other eye they did not follow. And I think the study was almost 12,000 eyes. And they found no statistical difference. I don't know what the panel would like to say after I finish my talk, but I'm still following PTA in my protocol as routine for all the patients. The main reason being legality. So PTA we know has to be 4-0 and we don't cross that line, and the flap thickness will, and more the depth of, more the thicker the flap and more the ablation depth will also lead to ectasia. So the basic pathophysiology here is, of course, thicker flaps, deeper ablations, leaving thinner RSTs can lead to this. Epithelial hyperplasia, Bowman's layer breaks can lead to ectatic regions, and both intralamellar and subsequent interfibrillary slippage contribute to chronic biomechanical failure and ectasia after the surgery. There is thinning and loss of rigidity, stress-bearing regions of the stroma. Thinning of the collagen lamellae and loss of total number of lamellae can lead to basic management. Of course, if there is ectasia, one can go ahead and do intacs if the cone is decentered, and go ahead and do cross-linking. But cross-linking is a necessity. I don't think we should wait. So if patients with LASIK treatment have developed ectasia, they have to be treated. Normally in keratoconus, we wait because we know statistically that 22% of keratoconus do not progress. But this patients should not be wait, and we should go ahead and do the treatment. Invasive management, of course, the worst case scenario, if the cornea becomes really, really thin, PK, which is not done anymore, but now DALC would be another good option. So the take-home message here would be, in regression, the refraction post-refractive remains quite stable, so the patient may get some percentage of the number back. Increase in epithelial thickness, increase in corneal thickness and mapiment. So we have to check the pre-op data and the post-op data. And normal pattern is seen on the topography. In ectasia, progressive increase of refraction may be cylindrical in different axes, irregular astigmatism, epithelial thinning noted on the tip of the cone, corneal thinning noted on pachymetry and the posterior float, and abnormal shape, asymmetry, bow tie, inferior superior steepening. All of this can lead a difference between ectasia. Treatment, of course, is glasses, contact lenses, lasers, and enhancement procedures. As far as regression goes, here it can be intercorneal rings, cross-linking, DALC or PK. So these are the references, and I would like to thank Dr. Chitra to have asked me to participate in the course. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kumar. There's one question before I go on my talk, and you don't disappear after that. Do you believe that axial length measurement also has a role to play in the investigative protocol of refractive surgery? Dr. Praveen, if you're there, you could answer that.
I think I'm here, but I think that's actually very, very important, because a lot of times there is axial length change in patients later on, even after 21 years. And since we don't measure it and pay a lot of attention to this, we consider that we are to blame when there is regression after LASIK surgery. But I think recently I was looking at a study that actually said that axial length change does account for a significant amount of regression after LASIK surgery. So I think would be a good protocol to add that to your workup before and follow up.
Actually, Praveen, we do an axial length measurement for all of our patients now, besides the topography.
So I'll go on to my talk. We'll keep the discussions more if we have time. A very good afternoon to one and all of you, and thanks a lot for being in my course, and thank you attendees for being with us. We all now do understand that all of these procedures have a very significant role to play in the refractive surgery armamentarium. It is just, this topic is just going to tell you about the stand of SMILE based on what we have in evidence. So it seemed to make sense to compare SMILE with all the some of the procedures based on the visual outcome analysis. There's astigmatic issues, which seems to be a little controversial. The biomechanical understanding, whether it is as inflated a role to play or is it as in line with the other procedures, SMILE versus Contura, and a little about regressions and enhancements. Not moving. So when you look at the different papers, when you look at the refractive outcomes, what comes to light in many of these papers is that the SMILE and femtolasic are pretty similar at 20/40 and 20/20. But when you go further down and check, there seems to be some gain of vision in the SMILE procedures, though we cannot say it as a significant point to be noted, but there are many papers which claim. When you look at the predictability over the 3 month, 6 month and 1 year period, SMILE seems to be on par with femtolasic. This is another randomized control study of femtolasic versus SMILE of 70 patients, wherein we looked at the safety, predictability, and the stability. And what we found was they were so very similar at all time points in these eyes. So what is it which seems to be very promising for SMILE is the SMILE lenticule design itself is aspheric, and that in itself there's a lesser induction of spherical abrasions. We all do understand that there is some spherical abrasions which are induced with the excimer laser because of the peripheral energy losses and the smaller functional optic zone. It also seems to be interesting to see that the centration on the visual axis seems to be quite favorable and doing well in spite of not having all those eye trackers which are there with the excimer laser. And the larger effective zone with smaller transitions is again a favorable point. And the other important thing is the fact that it's so obvious there's less amount of the nerves denervation which is occurring. So the less dry eye status would mean less inflammatory mediator release, and that could be a reason for a more optimal vision. Again, the lesser regressions are explained by a more stable wound healing response and hence a lowered enhancement rates. When you look at the astigmatism, different studies tell us that there are about 10 to 12% of undercorrection occurs with SMILE. But if you look at the higher grades of astigmatism over 3 diopters, both femtolasic and SMILE seems to have shown undercorrection. There was no statistical differences. Rather, there have been suggestions in some papers about manual compensation and the triple marking centration. And based on that, there was even an understanding that probably we could increase a 10% increase in over the refractive cylinder value, which is being entered. But then again, this has not yet become a standardized refraction protocol. And again, the amount of astigmatism pre-op is something to be wary of about the amount of correction post-op. As far as the manual cyclotorsion thing, we did do a study in our center also, wherein it was tried to be just after the dock, we tried to position the lenticule exactly in the 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock meridian, but there was not a very significant difference in that. So probably it's promising. Maybe there's a lesser induction of higher order aberrations and spherical aberrations and coma in some of these papers. In higher grades of astigmatism, again, there is no head-to-head comparison. If you look at the biomechanical understanding studies, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the studies. Rather, it's probably because of the diverse characteristics of the patients and the study designs. Probably an RCT should be done analyzing the lower myopes separately and the higher myopes, comparing them with ORA and Corbis, both in all these studies. But one thing seems to be apparent, although you cannot be so specific, that probably PRK would come before SMILE and LASIK would come before SMILE, and then LASIK last of all, because it seems so reasonable to think that staying frapless is the way to go. The vertical cuts, which are definitely more inferior, apparently biomechanically, to the horizontal delamination which occurs in SMILE. And we are still to go way forward as far as the extra strengthening of the cross-linking is concerned. This was quite an old paper which compared the corneas of similar pachymetry and similar flap thickness and similar ablation patterns. It seemed to show in the early days that SMILE fared better, but we are not sure about it after doing many more SMILE over the years. Biomechanically, this is again another study of finite elements analysis, which told us that SMILE seemed to be more biomechanically stable, which probably hinted to us that we could try correcting higher refractive errors, but we are still not moved on beyond that. There are any number of studies which have come forward to look at the biomechanics based on the ORAs and Corvis, but we still are not very clear about which is most ideal. Ectasia again have been far and few and not well reported. Many of these so-called ectasia have been formed first keratoconus, which has not been correctly judged because there are so many tools by which we could analyze it. So probably all that we can say today is the changes are so subtle that it does not warrant any specific screening criteria to say that this procedure is better than this, then better than that. Again, this was one big study. 22 studies were conducted with a lot of RCTs and prospective studies and retrospective cohort studies, which again said that PRK and LASIK does better, then comes SMILE, and then comes LASIK. The next thing is extra, doing cross-linking with SMILE. It was seen that if you use a half fluence and low energy parameters, like some have used 30 milliwatts for 90 seconds, some have used 45 milliwatts for 75 seconds, it was seen that there was a mild haze, there was compactness of stroma, there apparently appeared to be increase in corneal resistant factor, no endothelial cell loss. In fact, Sri Ganesh et al. Did 40-eye study of SMILE Extra over a 12-month follow-up with no complications, and they claimed that SMILE Extra seemed to do better than a similar group of SMILE. Again, this was another study which said that the SMILE Extra had greater stability and over the regular SMILE procedures. Going further, this is another one-year comparison study comparing SMILE Extra versus Femto Extra. And this, the only conclusion which came was that the safety, efficacy, and predictability and stability was parallel in both these eyes. The next interesting thing which we would want to know is SMILE versus Contura. And we did 400 eyes prospective follow-up based on subjective refraction. And we found that both these procedures were predictable, were equally safe, were equally efficient. So we could at least come to an understanding in this limited study of ours that there was nothing more promising about one over the other procedures. But then we need to really look through many more studies before we could actually say anything conclusive. And if you look at enhancement or regression, it's definitely has been shown in any number of papers that LASIK procedures, the incidence of regression is more and the need for enhancement is no as compared to SMILE. In SMILE, the risk factors were if older age group, or if there was a higher mean spherical equivalent or a higher astigmatism, or if there has been an intraoperative suction loss. And the reasoning for this is the difficulty in retaining the original centration in these eyes after redocking because of the lack of visibility with the gas bubbles and the tissue edema. And probably there is some distortion of a stromal lamellae which occurs, because of which there is this possibility. Choice of approach for SMILE has been a lot more, like either you could do a PRK procedure or a thin flap LASIK, or you could use a circle software, of which the D approach seemed to be promising. Again, when there was a comparative study with surface ablation and circle cap to flap, it was seen that they were comparable. Of course, we need to accept that if you do an enhancement post SMILE, all the claimed advantage of SMILE is lost. And because you are again limited by the vagaries of excimer, but the only thing which you see is a fresh cut to lift the SMILE may not be challenged by the epithelial growth if you do a circle software. And again, because the inflammatory response is minimal, it probably makes you think that the secondary regression would be low. So basically, I don't think we could conclude majorly from this literature search, but at least what we do understand is that SMILE has a role to play, FemtoLASIK has a role to play, and PRK has a significant role to play. Beyond that, maybe more years and many more studies would help us completely understand where we stand as far as these procedures are concerned. That is the superiority of one over the other. Thank you very much. We shall now go on to our next speaker. Is there any question to be asked on this topic?
Very nice presentation, Chitra. If I can ask one question from the patient's perspective, you've probably operated a lot of patients with SMILE as well as LASIK. Yeah. Keeping the complications and the biomechanics aside, which group do you think is more satisfied with their outcomes, just as a practitioner?
Definitely our SMILE patients are extremely happy. Their complaints of dry eyes are less, and the visual outcome is satisfying. If you make them sit across, compare them with a FemtoLASIK, vision to vision may not be so different, at least based on the different papers we see, but the SMILE patients are very happy. But when it comes to treating high grades of astigmatism, honestly, we feel that our Femto-Contura patients do much better than SMILE in high grades of astigmatism. And our PRK patients, except for the initial period of healing and all that, are all happy patients.
Just to add on to this, from what we studied, the first day experience, the wow factor, the smile patients have it more than even the femtolasic patients. I think they're the most comfortable lot. I think this is something that evolved out of a study of 400 patients also. And all other things, of course, is what has already been said.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ramurthy, who is chairman of the Eye Foundation Group of Hospitals, a great surgeon and also a person with a very perceptual understanding of ophthalmology as a whole, and of course, the do's and don'ts of refractive surgery. And he's going to be telling us, talking on an interesting topic, which we all need to know, phakic IOLs and keratoconus, what we should know. Thanks, Dr. Mahipal, for joining us.
Thank you, Chitra, for this invitation. I think the indications for phakic intraocular lenses for keratoconus are where the keratoconus is stabilized because of the aging or because the cornea has been cross-linked. And it's important that the patient's spectacle-corrected visual acuity is good and they are not hooked on to their contact lenses, because the vision that they get is going to be what they get with their glasses. We were initially thinking decentered cones do not do well, and we're only doing it for centered cones, but I'll be alluding to the study we did, and now we feel that decentered cones can also be taken up with certain caveats. There is this two-step approach. First is the stabilization of the cone, stopping progression. For that, we just do collagen cross-linkage, or otherwise, if there's enough tissue available, there's enough decentration, then we do a collagen cross-linkage with topo-guided PRK, and sometimes it's CXL with Intacs. I'm not going to go into those details. And then once the cornea is stabilized with a manifest refraction as well as topography is concerned, 6 to 12 months later, if the patient is wanting a visual rehabilitation, then we think of a toric intraocular lens implantation, phakic intraocular lens implantation. And as you can see over here, this is a situation where there's gross decentration. The best corrected visual acuity is just 618, a significant amount of cylinder. This patient underwent topo-guided PRK with collagen cross-linkage. And what you see subsequently is that the amount of cylinder has gone down and the best corrected visual acuity is 6.9 plus. You have a more regular bow tie now, and it's a more centered cone. This patient would do well with a subsequent phakic IOL implantation. And here, another extreme situation, the cone appears fairly well centered by a high refractive error, and best corrected visual acuity with glasses is not that good, 612. We went ahead with a Intacs with CXL. I'm not going to show you the procedure. You can see that the cone is much better centered. The refractive error has decreased, but the cylinder acceptance has actually gone up from -1.5 to 4, and the best corrected visual acuity has improved. This again, if it is remained stable for 6 months to a year, this would be a good indication for doing a subsequent phakic intraocular lens procedure, which is no different from what we do in other cases. So I'm not going to really run through the video. And this is just to show you that this is the way the lens gets centered very well. This is one of our earlier cases. This is actually a iatrogenic keratoconus case, which we did. And you can see the post-operative picture over here with the Intacs and the toric ICL in place. And this was extreme degree of keratoconus where we did just a single segment with collagen cross-linkage, waited for a period of almost 1 year, and subsequently implanted a toric IPCL for the rehabilitation of this patient. One caveat I would like to add is that because of the central bulge that you have with the keratoconus patients, you should be very wary or very careful about the measurement of the anterior chamber depth. In a normal cornea like this is what you get. But when you have a patient with a central keratoconus, you might get a fallacious reading as far as the AC depth is concerned. There might be quite a bit of crowding in the periphery, and we burnt our hands initially. This is a patient who had, you can see a couple of times we tried to reposition the lens. Basically, it was a sort of an optic capture where the edge of the lens was coming forward. Subsequently, we realized that these lenses have to be made slightly smaller. This is actually a lens exchange I'm doing. The iris atrophy you are seeing there is because of a couple of attempts at repositioning this lens. And this is exactly the same part of the lens that's being implanted, but a smaller size. So there was also suggestion that you do UBM and try to measure the sulcus to sulcus. But today, and also do a anterior segment OCT, look at the peripheral thickness. But what we have started doing now is to, depending upon the central cone that is there, reduce the size of the lens that we implant by 1 to 2 dimensions, that is by 0.25 to 0.5 millimeters. As far as the challenges are concerned, the post-implant uncorrected visual acuity would be similar to the best spectacle corrected visual acuity and definitely not better. In case the patient requires contact lenses previously, especially the rose scale lenses or the scleral contact lenses for visual rehabilitation, they may not be optimal candidates. It's a difficulty in determining the endpoint of refraction itself in these keratoconus patients. And on high astigmatism, we may need customized lenses, and our Indian companies are able to provide that. And quite often you will be pleasantly surprised that your optometrist has noted a significant refractive error, but the patient appears to be reasonably comfortable subsequent to these procedures. Of course, this is not a rule, but you come across these few exceptions. There is a possibility of residual error should always be explained to these patients. Obviously, it's not refractive accuracy, but debulking of the refractive error that we are looking at. In our retrospective study of 126 eyes, which we have submitted for publication, the toric ICL and toric IPCLs we implanted after stabilization of keratoconus, when the patients were comfortable, best spectacle corrected visual acuity, 12 of these eyes had intakes performed in them. The minimum follow-up of all these patients for 1 year. You'd see that these patients were slightly older, and the Kmax was not in the region of 60, 65, and more moderate 53, 54. And all these patients had collagen cross-linkage, either with topo-guided PRK or with Intacs procedure, and some of them just collagen cross-linkage alone. The post-operative outcome was extremely gratifying in the sense that less than 0.5 diopters of residual error, we are able to achieve in 80% of our eyes, and less than 90% achieved less than 1 diopter of residual refractive error. As far as the efficacy is concerned, almost in all segments, the post-operative corrected distant visual acuity was better than the pre-operative visual acuity. As far as gain or loss of lines was concerned, there was just about 10% of patients who lost 1 line and just 1 patient who lost 2 lines of visual acuity. In all other cases, there was either maintenance of the visual acuity or improvement in the visual acuity. The other outcome measures that we looked in were what about low cylinder and high cylinder, did it make a difference? The toric ICL and toric IPCL, the Indian variation, which we use more often because they could be custom made for high cylinders, and whether centered versus decentered cones. Decentered cones, initially we thought were contraindications for implanting these phakic intraocular lenses, but there were a group of decentered cones where the patients were happy with the best spectacle corrected visual acuity. We took them up for phakic intraocular lenses, and it was gratifying to see these patients did quite well. Whether it was less than 4 diopters of astigmatism or more than 4 diopters of astigmatism, the results were quite comparable. You can see that all these patients finally had an excellent visual acuity subsequent to the implantation of the lens. As far as whether it was TICL or TIPCL, that is the imported variant or the Indian variant, again, the results were quite comparable. As I mentioned earlier, the frequency of implanting, the Indian variant is a little higher, thankfully so, because it's also more cost effective, simply because we could also get them custom made for extremes of refractive error. And these results are extremely gratifying as far as the patient is concerned. Coming to decentered was a decentered cone. Mind you, when I'm talking about decentered cone, these are patients who are happy with the spectacle correction. We found that in both these segments, again, the results were quite comparable and gratifying. To sum it up, toric phakic intraocular lenses are effective in rehabilitation of carefully selected cases of keratoconus. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ramamurthy. You threw a lot of light on this. I would want Dr. Mahipal to share his screen, and just one question. Would you plan to do a phakic IOL in an early case of a middle-aged man, Dr. Mahipal, without doing a primary CXM?
Say it depends upon whether there is a progression or not. Ideally, I would want to cross-link a cornea, but in case the person is absolutely steady that we know that there is no increase, then maybe you could do it. And that's about, say, 35, 40, 45 years of age. You could look at it. But the primary thing is that you need a stability of the cone. That's for sure.
Our next speaker is none other than Dr. Mahipal Sachdev, who needs no introduction. Nobody could have done a great job as a president in these troubled times, and it needs a restless and a very capable person as him who enjoyed pushing mountains on his way. He is going to be talking to us on best methods to deal with flap complications. On to you, Dr. Mahipal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chitra, for having me in your course. So there are several complications that can happen because of LASIK. So this time they could be refractive complications, undercorrection, overcorrection, associated with laser or associated with the flap. So this I am going to just show a couple of videos for flap related complications. So this is the particular case where we were using a new keratome. This is the mark. Unfortunately, we didn't use ink here, but there is still the indentation that is there. 100 micron flap. You can see here that this is the flap. It goes fully and then comes. But just watch here that this is a raw surface. And if you look here, the flap, it's a free flap, and you can see that this is an edge that is avulsed. So never ever take away your microkeratome with a jerk. Because the flap may be, in case there is a free cap, the cap or the flap may be in the microkeratome. So now what we have to do is that we have to put the flap back so that there is a good adhesion. And you can see here that we are trying to put this at the proper place. And in this particular case, we are going to look at the marks. Plus, you can see the hinge that we have had. The hinge is going to be the area where we are going to look at wanting to match the avulsed edge. You can see this avulsed edge, it is not round. So you can actually use this for going to match it. And once we are drying it up, we see that this is not the right side up. It seems to be the stroma, which is up. So therefore, what you have to do is that you can put it upside down. Maybe you could do a taco technique also beforehand, but it's very difficult to find out right before putting it. So now we can see it's a shining edge on top, and we are sure that the flap is in the proper position. So all that you have to do is the alignment. I'll just go forward. I'll just also show you. Can you see this mark here just before? See, that is the mark which is there, which you can see. These are the marks, and we align this cut edge. And we dry up the flap perfectly. Once you have dried up the flap, you need to wait for a couple of minutes. I normally tend to wait for 4 or 5 minutes. You can see again the marks which are there. They are very well aligned. This is also very well aligned. And we wait for the adhesion to happen and remain there. And then you put a bandage contact lens, and the patient does very, very well. And this is the post-op picture for that. Now, this is something that I wish to say is that in case of a microkeratome, if there is a suction loss or there is a break in the suction, or if the motor gets jammed, do not withdraw and do not cut, because this is apparently what happened when you have a situation. The patient came to me after 3 days of the procedure. You can see an attempt has been made, like it's a free flap to put it there. But if you look at the backside of the flap, you can see it's a biplanar flap. So when the motor came, most probably it came to this level, got jammed, went back, and then came at the next level. And therefore you are getting a biplanar flap that is there. Whatever you may try in this particular case, we put the biplanar flap again and tried that it should be well adhered. Obviously it's edematous, it would not adhere, and we went ahead and put sutures so as to keep it in place. And once the sutures have been applied over time, you can see that this particular flap, we were just leaving it, put bandage contact lens. It's an eccentric flap also. That is there, but this is the post-op day 1, but over time the flap started to melt. 3 weeks post-op, we threw away the flap, and the cornea has a lot of plasticity, and you can see that because of the plasticity, this is the edge. The patient did regain good workable vision. Flap-related complications, when you have toxic material in between, there could be a central toxic keratopathy or a DLK. If you have that, you will just go ahead and take it off, and you need to wash it well. You can use antibiotics and maybe a drop of steroid, but you have to remove this entire material which is there. and do not kind of postpone the wash which is there. So this is what you do as regards the DLK. Epithelial ingrowths can also happen, and epithelial ingrowths happen if the flap is not well adhered under these circumstances. This is there is a track here. I don't know whether you can make out, and this is a huge patient has been there for a long time. Do not ignore this patient. The patient came to us from outside, and you have to actually relift the flap, which is not at all difficult. Even after several years, the flap can be relifted, and you can see here once the flap is relifted, there is because of the corneal melt that has happened, it's slightly difficult to and see that epithelial nests that have gone. So be very careful that you don't kind of rupture or perforate the flap which is there. So you lift it up, and you can see in this particular case that this is it. You wash it. You can use alcohol. You can use mitomycin C, and you can put glue and contact lens. So this is, you can see this is the area where you can see that this is where you had the epithelial ingrowth and the collagen melting. So glue can be put at that particular time, which we are putting. So this is the glue so that you don't get an epithelial ingrowth again. And then you will put a bandage contact lens on top of it. So you can see that this is the glue that is being applied. And we can then go ahead and put a contact lens so you can see, and the patient did well. When you are having regression and you need to do enhancements, the problem is what should you do? So there are a couple of things that you can do. You can do an ASOCT, which is very important, because that by even if you have fed, say I fed I have used a keratome of 120 microns, it is not sure that the flap was 120 microns. So doing an ASOCT, you will get the flap thickness, you will get the epithelial thickness, plus you will get the residual stromal bed. That is most important for you to get the residual stromal bed. You can do a flap lift anytime, even several years, but the longer the flap has been there and you are doing a flap lift, the chances of an epithelial ingrowth are there. So these are certain things you can mark with a 30-gauge needle on a slit lamp. You can lift it with a blunt spatula, etc. But normally with a relift, the issue is only of never the issue is of identifying, but the issue is only of an epithelial ingrowth. So what I do as a normal case is, see, I'm drying this, and you just depress. Can you just see, if you depress here, you can see that this line comes into view. So that is the only thing. I never do it on the slit lamp. I'm never bothered about it. I will just depress after making the flap dry, the edge dry, and then you can easily lift it up and go back and do it. When you're doing a recut, that's always a problem, because in a recut, you can have slivers, or you can go into a different plane. That is very, very difficult. So a PRK is a good thing. If you are recutting, then you could use at a deeper plane and a bigger flap that you can do. And specifically in a femto, what has been described is that if you can clearly identify where the femto edge is, you can just do the side cut and do that side cut inside of the, not outside. When you're using a blade, you do it outside, but when you are using a femto, you do it inside, so that you can lift the flap from inside, and it is like a fresh cut that is there. So this is when let's come to a couple of complications with the femto laser. You can see in this particular case, this is a stop of the laser. And is there any other talk, Dr. Chitra? You can tell me to stop whenever you want.
No, there is one recorded talk.
Okay, fine. So this is you can go back again in the same femto, and you can pick up the flap. I'll just show you that this is where the femto stopped earlier. And you can see here that we are just picking it up from this particular point. See here, and this is where the second cut, the first cut stopped. So this is where the first cut stopped, and you will get away with this very well. There is the corneal opacity that you can see, which, you can see here. This is the laser going, there's a corneal opacity here, and there's a vertical gas breakthrough. So if there are corneal opacities, the femto could be a problem. If there is any foreign body, this is the eyelash which is there. You can see this is going to give you a cold spot, and this is going to give you a problem. So remove all the debris which are there. You can have an air bubble go into from the collector channels. You can see this is a proper flap that is happening, and this is an air bubble. It will not, you have to do the tracker off. That's about it, and there is no other problem that is there. This is the final video I'll wish to show. If there are such macro striations, there is no way that a lift of the flap and just a rewash, which was done elsewhere, can do anything. You have to do it on retro illumination. You have to remove the anchorage of the epithelium that is there. And once you have removed, you put hypotonic saline, you relift the flap, and then after the flap is swollen, you will use the Merosol sponge to iron it out. Take your time to iron it out, and on the table you will never get the entire stria going off, so don't worry about it. The folds have been swollen, put a bandage contact lens, and the patient will do well. That is there. So challenges are what makes life interesting, and overcoming them is what makes it meaningful. So there could be complications of LASIK as regards the flap, but knowing how to manage it is going to be something which is very important. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Maipal, for a very extensive talk which covered nearly everything. We will be go on to sharing the, very sorry I didn't read your message at all, Dr. Harun. We could hear your talk. Just one last question. Dr. Praveen Krishna, are you there? He's not.
Yes, Chitra.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you, like, supposing you get a patient coming from elsewhere and he has a residual error, because we really don't know what could have been done. The more we understand, there could be an irregular stromal bed and all that. Would you do a PRK or would you lift the flap if it is within a year or two?
No, I think that is a very important question. If there is a patient who has been operated by somebody I do not know, where I do not have access to what has gone on during surgery, I would almost always do a surface ablation.
Yes. So shall we go on? There could be any number of questions which could be asked, but I think we should hear your recorded presentation. Thank you, doctor, for staying with us. Thank you. Thanks a lot, everybody, for being with us. I think I truly enjoyed my session. I hope all of you did. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Chitra, ma'am, it's a keynote address is there.
Yeah, that's what. You could show that.
Yeah. Our AV team kindly.
Very good afternoon. Greetings from Bangladesh. At the outset, I must thank to the organizers of the All India Ophthalmological Society for giving me the opportunity to discuss what I think is extremely important related to the world of refractive surgery SMILE, and particularly on the pearls for optimizing its outcome. I have no financial disclosures. As you know, small incision lenticule extraction has been evolved as a flapless, bladeless, orderless, minimally invasive, cornea-based, all femtosecond laser intrastromal refractive lenticule extraction procedure to treat myopia and myopic astigmatism. SMILE has brought a paradigm shift in the field of laser vision correction from the conventional flap-based corneal ablative procedure to a corneal intrastromal refractive lenticule extraction procedure. The evolution of refractive surgery dates back in 1949 when none other than the father of the modern refractive surgery, Professor Jose Barraquer from Spain, brainchilded the conception of keratomylosis, which saw the light in 1963 when for the first time he published his work on keratomylosis based on the fundamental principle that the cornea contributes 2/3 of the total refractive power of the eye. So what is behind the evolution of refractive surgery? Well, if we evaluate all of these procedures, PRK, LASIK, femtolasic, SMILE, you will see that over the time these procedures have become more safer, more accurate and more predictable. The dream of Dr. Jose Barraquer came true in 2008 when Professor Dr. Secundo first described the extraction of an intrastromal lenticule after lifting a flap, and eventually the technique evolved into modern small incision lenticule extraction. Although historically Dr. Secundo performed the first SMILE in 2008, the first commercial sales of SMILE began in 2010 and US FDA approved SMILE in 2016, and by 2018 more than 1 million procedures were performed around the globe. The perceived benefits of SMILE includes greater corneal biomechanical stability, better conservation of corneal nerves, less induction of dry eye, no flap-related complications, less induction of higher order aberrations, better refractive predictability, and no need to change from one station to other. Different meta-analysis in the literature, various randomized and non-randomized control trial have shown that in terms of refractive outcome, particularly as far as the efficacy and predictability is concerned, both SMILE and LASIK are comparable. And if we look at the corneal biomechanics, we know that the anterior 150 microns of the corneal stroma gives more strength to the cornea than the posterior 300 microns. And different studies have shown that SMILE is biomechanically stronger than LASIK. Various studies to assess the corneal biomechanics using an ultra-high-speed Scheimpflug camera, Corbis ST, have shown that SMILE is biomechanically stronger than LASIK, but PRK ranks the top. As has been reported in various literatures about SMILE ectasias, preoperative workup, as with other refractive surgical procedures, is extremely important, particularly Kmax, Pachy at the thinnest location, the front and the back elevation maps, the Belin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia display, particularly the progression index and the final D. Now I routinely perform the combined Corbis ST values with the Pentacam values, which gives me an overall combined tomography and biomechanical assessment of the cornea, particularly CBI, BAD-D and TBI. The other issue is the relationship of SMILE with dry eye. Basically, SMILE results in minimal cutting of the anterior corneal nerves and therefore induces less dry eye symptoms in terms of tear breakup time, corneal subbasal nerve density, corneal sensitivity, OSDI score, overall patient comfort, and tear osmolarity. Now, as far as the relationship between higher order aberration and SMILE is concerned, various studies have shown that SMILE induces lesser amount of total higher order aberration and spherical aberration in comparison to LASIK. SMILE involves a number of standard techniques such as docking, femtosecond laser applications, lenticule dissection, and lenticule extraction. During femtosecond laser application, essentially 4 cuts are made to create the lenticule. The first cut is the lenticule cut, the second cut is the lenticule side cut, third cut is the cap cut, and finally the cap opening incision. While docking, patient is encouraged to look at the green flashing light. When centration is confirmed, suction is activated. The first cut is the lenticule cut in a spiral in pattern, followed by the 360-degree lenticule side cut, followed by the cap cut in a spiral out pattern, and finally the cap opening incision. Anterior plane is delineated on the left side and the posterior plane is delineated on the right side. By taking the Dan dissector, anterior plane is dissected first in a windshield wiper fashion. Then the posterior plane is dissected in a sweeping motion. The separated lenticule is extracted with the help of a microforceps and is checked for its completeness. Corneal interface is flushed with BSS and tapped with the spatula to check for the addition with the help of the slit lamp attached with the Visumax laser system. We published our initial experiences and data in the Bengal Ophthalmic Journal and in the Journal of the Ophthalmological Society of Bangladesh in 2019. And we encountered few complications such as suction loss, opaque bubble layer, black spots, difficult lenticule dissection, difficult lenticule extraction, incisional tear, cap lenticular adhesion, and epithelial defects. And in the study we found, as the surgeon gets experienced, the number of complications got reduced in last 100 cases in comparison to the initial 100 cases. So what I think for easier transition from flap to cap is observation of a SMILE by the experienced surgeon, which is very, very important. The another important thing is initial wet lab training, and one needs to start with femtosecond lenticule extraction or flex, then converting to pseudo SMILE, then SMILE through 4 mm side cut, and finally SMILE through 2 mm side cut. In flex, both the lenticule and the cap is created, and the cap is converted to a flap, and the lenticule is extracted by an open sky procedure. Suction loss may occur in an anxious, uncooperative patient due to sudden movement or squeezing of the eye or due to excess fluid around the cone. If the suction loss occurs in a situation of less than 10% lenticule cut, or during lenticule side cut, or during cap cut, or during cap side cut, it is better to redock and repeat the procedure. This is a patient who came for a SMILE. The patient was highly apprehensive, anxious because of the sudden squeeze. He developed a suction loss. Then the patient was subsequently converted to a femtolasic by taking a larger size cone with a larger corneal flap diameter, and subsequently femtolasic was done and patient has an excellent visual outcome. Black spots may result from inadequate laser delivery in a localized area, due to the entrapment of the small air bubbles, water droplets, or any debris between the patient's interface and the corneal surface, which leads to microadhesions and difficulty in dissection of the plane. This may be prevented by adequately weighting the cornea before docking and avoiding any debris on the ocular surface as well as on the patient's interface. OBL can be observed in cases with too high or too low laser energy settings, and they are common in thicker corneas and thinner lenticules. These leads to microadhesions and creates resistance to dissection. So optimization of the energy setting is very, very important in this type of situation. There are situations when inadvertent dissection of the posterior plane first before the anterior plane results in cap lenticular adhesions where lenticule gets stuck to the undersurface of the cap. Blunt hook side of the spatula is used to identify the lenticule edge and to create a plane between the overlying cap and the lenticule, or to peel it off from the undersurface of the cap. Incisional tear may occur due to excessive surgical manipulation by the inexperienced surgeon. One should avoid forceful lenticule dissection and extraction by using bulky instruments. Frequent lubrication by artificial tears and use of bandage contact lens usually take care of the problems. Again, epithelial defect may result from excessive surgical manipulations and frequent use of topical anesthetic eye drops, and this can be taken care of by frequent use of lubricating eye drops and putting a bandage contact lens. There are situations when difficulty in lenticule dissection may rarely lead to retained lenticule fragment, which may be confirmed by ASOCT. SMILE has its limitations as well. Myopic sphere cannot be corrected beyond -10 diopter, and cylinder up to -5 diopter can be corrected. Equipment and consumables are expensive. Automated cyclotorsion compensation is not available. Hyperopia correction is not available at present. Newer advances in SMILE are on the way. Newer lasers from newer manufacturers having hyperopic treatments, presbyopic treatments, cyclotorsional treatments, and faster lasers with almost free floating lenticules. So my take-home message is, from flap to cap is always challenging for the beginners in SMILE as well as for surgeons experienced in performing flap-based corneal ablative procedures. Intraoperative complications during SMILE are mostly observed in initial cases. As the surgeon gets experience, the chances of complications become less. Right patient selection, proper docking, optimizing energy levels, meticulous surgical technique, and early recognition with proper management of complications is fundamental for optimizing the final visual outcome in SMILE. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr.